Welcome to the Athlete's Compass podcast. Each week, renowned sports scientist and founder of Athletica AI, Dr. Paul Larson, athlete, coach, and sports scientist Mariana Rakai, and coach and cyclist Paul Warloski discuss training, racing, and improving your health and fitness. Get ready for your journey to peak performance. Hello and welcome to the Athlete's Compass podcast, where we navigate training, fitness, and health for everyday athletes. If you are a female endurance athlete, especially over 40, you are going to want to pay special attention to today's podcast. Our guest is nutritionist Mikki Williden, PhD, and we are diving into the unique nutritional challenges faced by older female endurance athletes due to training demands and age-related changes. Mikki has been studying nutrition since her undergraduate days and now hosts an amazing weekly podcast called Mikkipedia, where she delves into topics like nutrition, longevity, fitness, and health. Plus, Mikki's a really fast runner herself. She's clocked a 2:55 marathon, which is incredible. So, Mikki, what first drew you to nutrition and what keeps you passionate about it?
Great question, Paul. And firstly, thanks so much for inviting me on the podcast. I feel honored to come on and chat about this, and excited because it's such a passion area for me. I think, truthfully, it was my obsession with diet and exercise as a teenager. So I'm a twin, and I grew up the chubby twin, and my mother and I dieted it was the thing you did back in the 80s. You would join your mum on the latest fad diet, like Rosemary Conley's hip and thigh diet, whatever the Women's Weekly was doing at the time. and it really got me interested in diet and nutrition, and probably in exercise, and of course probably not in a particularly healthy way, but I feel like it was the thing that sort of propelled me to want to learn more. And then there was, Body for Life, and I got into doing phys ed at university in addition to nutrition. And I guess it just grew from there. And like all of you, I'm sure I have a passion for learning and for trying to understand the research and also make it applicable to the sort of the general population.
So we aim to provide practical advice for everyday athletes, most of whom are runners, triathletes, cyclists, taking on everything from half marathons to ultras to Ironmans. Many women experience hormonal changes during perimenopause and menopause. How do these changes impact endurance training, and what kind of nutritional strategies can women implement to mitigate those negative effects on performance and recovery?
So some of the sort of really the larger things which can occur, or the major things that can occur, are both they're both hormonal, but then it's how those hormones affect behavior and habit, right? And I feel like that's where you can really sort of dive into nutritional strategies to help offset some of those. So as a woman goes through perimenopause, she's more insulin, she becomes more insulin resistant. In part, there is a declining in the estrogen levels, but actually over perimenopause, estrogen's all over the place. So at times it may be even 3 times as high as what would be considered normal. And we have estrogen receptors on every sort of cell in our body, it's everywhere. And that's why the changing hormones affect so many different areas. For some women, not all women, but for some women, there's an increase in inflammation due to these changing levels of estrogen, increased histamine response, and that's going to impact on recovery. The decline in progesterone will impact potentially on sleep, because progesterone is a really sort of, it's a calming brain neurotransmitter as well. And so if you're not sleeping well, it's obviously going to impact recovery, but it can also impact on how often we hit snooze in the morning rather than get up and do our training. So I think that's something else that I see. We don't tolerate alcohol as well. And I know obviously everyone has a different relationship with alcohol and how much they drink or otherwise, but even for some women, one glass of wine, which they, might usually otherwise enjoy, is going to impact again on that sleep disruption, levels of inflammation, the changing insulin level, or the subsequent change in how we tolerate carbohydrate can change how we distribute body fat, or how we store body fat, So there is an increase in that mid-range or mid-level belly fat that some women experience, and they've never carried fat around the middle before. In part, this also is because, well, it's estrogen and it's that change in inflammation as well. But also how we use carbohydrate during training. To my mind, this needs to change some of those habits and behaviors as well, particularly if you've come through that really high carb era, which I know a lot of people have or are in. It's more likely that we lose muscle, particularly if we're not aiming at protecting muscle during perimenopause. Because again, if you're insulin resistant, you aren't able to get energy into that cell. You're potentially going to, you lose muscle mass anyway. We are more anabolically resistant. So we are much like the insulin resistance. We aren't able to access or use those amino acids as effectively. Of course, training changes that, to become better, or to offset that. Training does help that. So there's a lot going on, basically.
It's all making
but also
sense
there's a lot we
for
can
me,
do.
Mikki. It's all making sense for me with my wife, my poor wife, going through a lot of these little changes
Here.
right now. Yeah.
My wife as well. It's just I feel badly. It's like there is so much change happening. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was watching both balls were making notes, and I'm nodding. I'm like, yeah, yes.
For sure, but of course, there's so much that we can do, and I think that's the thing. And I feel like sometimes people feel that these hormonal changes are inevitable, and they're just going to feel this way. It's just age, and they just have to get through. In addition to the obvious, which is HRT, there are so many things that you can do from a habits and behavior and a diet and how you approach training, which doesn't mean that you have to change everything you're doing. And I feel this is a really important point, particularly for us in that endurance space. So often we hear that, we have to change the way that we train, the way that we do, long distance training, or those longer sessions, which are sort of a cornerstone of an endurance athlete. It's how we become better at being an endurance athlete. And then you hear that, it's bad for you and you shouldn't be doing it. So that's what I talk to a lot of women about is, how do you sort of navigate those changes so you can still do the things that you love, but also get the most from it too.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've raised to me is a really important point. I'm hearing these strange, Mariana tells me about them sometimes, but these strange messages where, zone 2 training could be potentially detrimental for women in this period of time, which sounds absolutely crazy based on what you just told me. Like you're saying there's problems ultimately with carbohydrate handling. And to me, that sounds like, well, zone 2 training could only be of assistance in that, in terms of your ability to use fat as a fuel and to handle carbohydrate, to become less insulin resistant, right? Because these hormones and stuff, they're going to move possibly, but if you have a more robust overall system able to handle those changes, that to me, that puts you up in a better situation, reducing the incidence of overfat that you described and all those sorts of things. So
Paul, I 100% agree, and it really surprises me that people don't talk more about this. If I'm honest, and even if I'm thinking about women who, it's not necessarily the focus of what we're discussing today, but women in the luteal phase of their menstrual cycle, where you are slightly more insulin resistant as well. And to me, the solution isn't just to push that carbohydrate more during training, it's to get better fat adapted so you're not so reliant on it. Like it's just, and hey, but everyone does things differently, I suppose.
I'm so glad that we're talking about this, because it's just so puzzling, that the message. But the more I'm thinking about it, the more I think like it's so important to define what that low intensity training is, because we have like 1 to 3 intensity zone system. We have up to 7. So when we're looking at when we're talking about that zone 1, which in zone 5 system is basically walking, or you go for a nice little bike ride with your kids. But if we're focusing on that, or like a lot of women walk for fitness, and to me it's not intensive enough, your heart rate doesn't get high enough. A couple of times we've been talking about the runner's high. We're all runners, so we know what we're talking about. But you can't get into intensity high enough that you can actually elicit the runner's high, the feel good, the flow when you're walking.
Yeah.
So I think like when we're looking at like people who talk about you should not do zone 2 training, I think part of it might be that they're talking about don't do aerobic training too hard going into the moderate intensity, which would be, the gray zone or sweet spot, because that taxes your body a little bit more and takes longer to recover from. So,
and I think that your point on recovery is a really important one, Mariana, and that's where I feel I think auto-regulation is key with any of this. Like, you'll get a guru telling you that this is the way it is and this is what you should or shouldn't do. And so we almost lose sight of the fact that we give away some of that power of our own decision-making, and we listen instead to the rules and behaviors that, because this is how women experience this, perimenopause. So this is what you must or mustn't do. But instead, we just need to focus on auto-regulation. And, how do we feel? How do we feel during training? And are we allowing enough recovery? And sometimes you do have to sort of step back and go, you know what? All indicators are that I'm not recovering from the training that I used to be able to recover easily from. So I might need to change some things. And it doesn't mean giving away some of those or the aspects of training that you really love or that you really need in order to be an endurance athlete. But it is focusing more on, potentially, how do I prioritize sleep better? Because it's something that we talk about a lot, or I talk about a lot with women, is in this age, you're often, you might be in the throes of, your career. You may be raising children. You're trying to maintain your relationships with friends. You may have a partner. You're running a household. You may be caring for parents. And in all of those things, often women forget to prioritize themselves, or training is how they prioritize themselves. And I think that's great. But I also think that, if your sleep is suffering, or if you're not listening to other signs and symptoms around that under recovery, then that's where changes do need to be made, for sure.
absolutely. I think sleep plays such a big part of it. And I've noticed when I've prioritized sleep, everything else kind of falls into place. You recover better, your cognitive abilities are better. So whatever a female endurance athlete in their 40s, 50s, 60s need to do they need to drop that glass of wine to sleep better? Well, it depends on your priorities, right? Occasional glass of wine, it's fine. You're having it with dinner with your friends, or as we discovered earlier during our Athletes Compass podcast, you have to have that 12 o'clock with your lunch instead of with your dinner.
Yeah.
So, like you said, like we're all so different too.
For sure. And a few things which I encourage people to think about when it comes to sleep, if they're having sleep-related issues, which many women experience. Firstly, are you actually just under fueling? So one of the biggest issues I see with sleep is that people who underfuel during the day particularly, and then potentially binge at night or graze at night and overeat their calories, like they're not getting their fuel when they need it, and that stress on the body can impact on cortisol, particularly cortisol levels in the evening time, so they're unable to optimize their melatonin production, because cortisol and melatonin work in opposition together or alongside each other. So certainly looking at fueling, and protein plays a big part in that, and I think we'll probably discuss that soon. Caffeine, a lot of people who are sleep deprived rely heavily on caffeine, and where they used to maybe be able to tolerate 3 or 4 coffees, sometimes they don't even tolerate just one. And I really encourage anyone with sleep problems to actually just try. I mean, I love coffee, but actually just see how you fare without it for, once you get over the withdrawal. Like, does it actually change your sleep? Because for some people it really can. Even the 10 a.m. coffee can impact on how they sleep later in the evening time. And with regards to habits and behaviors, like when you are someone who really doesn't have a lot of time during the day to focus on things you want to focus on, then your unwind is to sit either watching television or on your device. That's something which you may need to change as well. Like even how you engage with it. Like, do you need blue light blocking glasses when you're watching TV to help offset some of that blue light? What's the light environment like in your house? Lights that are above your eye line impact the brain differently than lights that are below your eye line in the evening time, because above your eye line, your brain sort of gets that signal or read that it's sort of light and it's not necessarily time to unwind and go to bed, even if it's junk light, even if that light isn't actually bright enough to elicit that proper sort of awake signal. But lights that are more orange toned, that are below the eye line, send different signals to the brain as well. So looking at your light environment can help. And then of course my area, or much more related to nutrition, would be the foods you eat at night and the supplements that you can take to help support sleep. And I can talk about them if.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going to go a bit. You mentioned fueling is really important to allow the person to go to sleep. I couldn't agree more, but there's lots of different ways that we could, interpret fueling before. So what are some good recommendations for what type of fueling are we actually talking about, Mikki, in the dinner time before bed period? What's your recommendations there?
With regards to carbohydrate, like actually having carbohydrate in the evening meal can help reduce a bit of the stress on the central nervous system, actually. And and I'm not talking about large amounts or a whole heap of sugar or anything like that, but some starch, sweet potato, rice produce.
Yeah, like even like a slow release kind of carbohydrate too, right? Like a nice like an apple or a pear or these sorts of things, right? Like nothing wrong with that, especially if it's off the back of a protein fat laden kind of dinner as well, right?
Absolutely, because you don't want to just have like a full on sort of high carbohydrate meal without that protein and fat. I think that's important because that will change how your body responds, because you'll spike insulin and your blood sugars can crash later on. But it's having a small amount of carbohydrate to help produce serotonin, which is a precursor to melatonin, and that does and that impacts, of course, on that central nervous system. So if you feel really sort of wired across the day, then that can change, sort of just relax your body a little bit, I guess, as a way to describe it. But also it's not just in that evening meal. I feel like it's across the day. So getting that protein distributed appropriately across the day so you are able to regulate blood sugar better than just having either too few calories, which can stress your central nervous system as well and impact on blood sugar regulation, or having a diet that is too low protein. And this is, sometimes people think that if they have like a smoothie for breakfast, and they have a chicken salad at lunch, and then they have a piece of meat at dinner, then that's a high protein diet. But if you sort of do the math on that, that might only be, 1 to 1.2 grams per kg of body weight of protein. Whereas I talk to athletes about getting, I would say, a minimum of 2 grams of protein per kg body weight. And in fact, I was speaking to a researcher and scientist in Florida, Jose Antonio, and he's now published a couple of case studies whereby his endurance athletes have, like older, so I say older, perimenopause, sort of menopausey age, and they're hitting 3 grams per kg of body weight for recovery, which, depending on your size, that may be a lot of protein. It might actually not absolute values be that much either, because it's the amino acids help with that recovery and repair of muscle tissue. And as athletes, you're just breaking down muscle all the time. Sort of went on a tangent on protein, but so I often
Totally.
I think people need to think more about that as well.
Yeah. So, Jose Antonio was on Training Science podcast with me as well. He said the exact same thing. I think it's his wife actually that's on 3 grams per kilo, and she's just this kick-ass masters female cyclist. I think she's winning events and stuff in the US, and she's really like quite stable as a result, anecdotally from him. So that's great that you're aligned with that, Mikki.
Yeah, I completely am. And often, like with the alcohol thing, like I think appropriate carbohydrate across the day as well can help offset things like alcohol cravings too. Like a lot of us, you may feel like, oh, I just could really do with like a wine at the end of the day to help unwind. But sometimes it's that you didn't get your carbohydrate. We didn't think about putting in carbohydrate post-training, which is where I like to see it. Again, it's, things like fruit or sweet potato and rice. They're my general sort of like recommendations. And of course, people will have what they want, but as like I sometimes feel like those cravings that tend to sort of kick up around perimenopause, menopause can be offset by thinking more about how people are setting up their diet across the day in that regards as well.
I remember Dr. Jose talked about creatine as well.
Yes. Yeah. I am a huge fan of creatine, and I think most people would be, like, out of all the supplements, caffeine aside, like creatine is probably one of the ones that has the most robust sort of evidence behind it. So that's definitely one that I recommend women take. And some women are, they're a little bit hesitant because of the potential bloating that can occur or water retention that can occur when you begin creatine. Not for everyone though. Like it certainly didn't. Like I didn't have that issue when I started taking it a couple of years ago. But for most people, it's a transient state, and just lasts maybe a couple of weeks. But I will say that I have chatted to some women who really experienced additional bloating, and really increased symptoms in their luteal phase of their menstrual cycle when they take creatine. Like that water retention is even worse. And also in perimenopause, some women experience even more sort of bloating and things like that. So if someone's listening to this and they notice that they have increased symptoms around their luteal phase, like I would just say sort of come off it for those 7 days and then start taking it again. Like otherwise there is no reason to cycle creatine. Like I have friends that have been on creatine for 20 years, it's no issue. But if you do notice challenges there, then that would be what I would recommend. And also think about the dosing as well, like 3 grams of creatine is what I would.
We kind of threw the menopause question to you in the beginning, but we didn't kind of like, I think it's important to define how do we know that we're in perimenopause, because yes, the estrogen fluctuates a lot depending on who you are. Probably a lot of different factors in there. But some of the common symptoms are related to sleep and, bloating, and some of the symptoms mimic overtraining, like
Yes.
night sweats, you're sleeping poorly, brain fatigue.
Yeah.
What are some of the symptoms that you see in endurance athletes that are maybe approaching perimenopause?
Yeah, great. And Mariana, you mentioned some of the major sort of common ones, and also what you said about the symptoms mimicking overtraining. I think that's important too. Like if you speak to doctors and specialists in the area, they will say, there's no blood test to say you are in perimenopause. Like they base it on symptoms, they base it on age. Of course, there are changes in FSH, like follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, but ultimately they base it on those other things. And I would also say check blood biomarkers for nutrients like iron, because many of the symptoms that you've just mentioned can be a function of like low iron, like the fatigue and the cognitive challenges and brain fog. Thyroid is another one as well, and thyroid for men and women does tend to sort of decline, thyroid function decline as we age, or it can. Look at levels of B12 as well, and don't just rely on your doctor to tell you that you are within normal reference range, because that doesn't necessarily reflect an optimal level for you. I also encourage women to get these nutrients also tested. But there are other symptoms as well, Mariana, like itchy ears and dry skin. And these are two things which a woman experiences. In fact, you can get phantom smells, like you may be sitting there and you like what's that burnt toast smell, and no one's like burning toast. Like this is another symptom. Like I think I looked at a list once that was like 108. It had 108 different things on it that someone can experience, and so clearly with so many symptoms, there's so much overlap for other things as well that may be going on.
While we're talking about supplements, we mentioned creatine. I started taking triple magnesium to see what effect it has on my sleep. I'm also taking herbal supplement like valerian root, which I find that it helps me fall asleep faster and stay asleep. What else herbal supplements would you recommend, like ashwagandha or others?
Yes, I really like ashwagandha for some people. It helps reduce cortisol. It definitely helps with sleep. And one thing we haven't, another symptom of perimenopause is increased anxiety, actually, and so ashwagandha can be really helpful for that. There is some contraindication, like people who have autoimmune conditions or thyroid conditions, or who may have a sensitivity to nightshades. So it's not a blanket statement a blanket supplement which I would recommend to everyone, but certainly for those that tolerate it, it can be really helpful. In addition to magnesium, taurine, which is an amino acid, and B6 can really help with GABA neurotransmitter production. So, and you can get supplements which have magnesium, taurine, and B6 in them. I would just say be mindful. You don't want to overdose on the B6. You don't want your total B6 to be, above maybe 50 milligrams a day. So just be mindful of where you're getting your supplemental B6 from. There are two others, like inositol and glycine, can also sort of act on the brain in a calming way as well. And so if magnesium isn't enough for some people, then 2 grams of inositol and 3 grams of glycine in powder form, and it's super cheap actually and pretty easy to get from most sort of online supplement places, and that's all, they're just powders that can also be really helpful.
Mikki, strength training is often something, you've mentioned that already, some heavy lifting is recommended for endurance athletes to improve performance and prevent injury. What are some beneficial nutritional tools that you'd recommend to support strength training?
Most of what we've talked about, Paul, so I think that like protein is key to my mind. So with strength training, to help with bone and also muscle, you need obviously those two stimuli. So you need the strength training and you need the protein. So in the amounts that I've already mentioned, the sort of 2 grams per kilogram body weight. But also what we know, as far as we know from science as it stands, is that the older you get, the more amino acids you need at one time for the brain to get that signal to initiate that muscle protein synthesis response. And leucine is a critical amino acid for that. It will sort of initiate that. And as we, if you were in your mid-20s, you may only need about, 2 grams of leucine to be able to achieve that response to initiate muscle protein synthesis. But the older we get, the more we need. And so you might need even 3.5 or 4 grams of leucine. And you'll be able to get that if you have a good quality protein source with whey or animal-based protein source, and an amount that might be about 40 grams of protein in a meal. So you often, people are recommending, at least 20 grams of protein, but I think that my read of the literature is, probably 40 grams of protein in a meal is what you want to be shooting for, which is different from 40 grams of meat. And I know that's obvious probably to us, but not to a lot of people. A lot of people think if I just have, 50 gram serve of meat, then I've got my protein. Whereas 100 grams of cooked meat generally will have about maybe 24, 25 grams of protein. So, and the brain needs that a couple of times a day. So it needs it. So the easiest way to sort of think about it is, hit 40 grams minimum protein for breakfast. And I am a fan of breakfast. Hit it again at dinner time, and then sort of collect the rest of your protein to meet your overall requirement across the course of the day. So it might be, protein rich snack, and of course lunch as well. So that to my mind is how you're getting your protein in to help support your strength-based training and recovery from that training, but also to get that maximal muscle protein synthesis response.
Is there anything with the timing of the protein after a workout?
If you look at the literature, Paul, total protein will trump protein timing, actually.
Okay.
And you hear different things. Like I hear some people say that you must get your protein in immediately post-exercise because of the anabolic resistance that we experience. Yet I also hear that, in fact, anabolic resistance is overcome by the training itself. So it doesn't actually matter when you get that protein in. I would say that if you ask someone, like I talk to a lot of people who are trying to improve their body composition and want to drop body fat. So I do encourage timing their nutrition around their training because I feel like their recovery is better for it because you're already playing with less calories anyway. So looking after training by fueling appropriately and then getting in your sort of protein calories post to help recovery can help offset sort of cravings and help improve recovery, in my experience. There's no research to probably support that, but that's just my clinical experience.
There's also, I've heard, taking like a 10, 20 grams of protein before a strength workout could be beneficial, but I don't know if this literature.
Yeah, I've heard that as well, and I just haven't found any like studies to show that
Mm-hmm.
That this particular amount is essential.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really comes into that you hear so much no, women shouldn't train fasted as well. That we need to make sure every workout has is in a fed state. And I think Paul and I, you and I have discussed this in the past, is that many of those endurance adaptations, may be better or enhanced when you aren't training in a fed state. I don't know. Again, it comes back to auto-regulation, doesn't it? Like, how do you feel when you train fasted? How do you recover? Are you able to get hit your training sort of metrics that you're wanting to achieve with that session? Are you able to, be your fittest, strongest self doing what you're doing already, or do you need to change things up? I think always looking at the individual's approach.
Yeah, context wins always, right? With all these various different things, and really, when it comes down to the individual and their ability to develop their own listening skills in terms of what their body needs. I don't think there's anything wrong with experimenting with any of these methods, whether it's fasted training, fed training, HIIT, L2 work. Like it's all sort of important at the right place at the right time. But I think it's when you get locked in your ways, you can run into these problems. And it brings me to one thing I wanted to ask you about is this you've spoken a lot about energy to the system, right? And there's this thing that this item that people talk about, RED-S, right? Or REDS. Maybe can you define for the listener what REDS is first, and then maybe what the potential issues around that are? And not just in perimenopausal, but in younger females, all humans ultimately.
Yeah. So relative energy deficiency in sport is essentially what, it almost sort of defines itself, doesn't it? But it's also about physiological changes to the system and also psychological changes and performance detriments and things like that. But if we're thinking about low energy availability, then low energy availability is when it ultimately is the thing that can drive RED-S, and it is when an athlete has, when you're looking at calorie intake, there's not enough.
Yeah, and it's ultimately there's not enough calories for the system, and it forms a stress in the brain, and then there's a stress response, and but it's, it goes back to all of if we have I'll geek out for a little bit, right? But we have a HPA axis, right? And then that HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, it talks to the gonadal axis, and all the hormones and stuff that you spoke about in the beginning, they're all kind of cycled as well. And there's a whole bunch of nasty little problems that kind of happen along the way. And things like they manifest in stress fractures for women, and the lack of the ability to deposit bone in the younger female, and probably all of us as well. Is there an issue with estrogen, which is the key hormone that deposits bone to the is that how it works?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So there is a reduction in estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, like all of those hormones, thyroid. And these are so important for energy metabolism and bone health and muscle growth and brain health as well. So that's why all of those systems, like I said sort of at the start of the podcast, like we've got, for example, estrogen receptors everywhere in our body. Same with thyroid receptors as well. So all of these things are going to be impacted, and it's critical, like for your young athletes, it's such a critical time period up until they're at least 20, where we're still developing and growing, where you're reaching that peak bone mass, and you really do set yourself up for challenges with bone health later on, which is so important in terms of our overall longevity. And this is an important area, just to shift back to the that sort of perimenopause, or women and older, like we lose bone mass anyway because of those declines in hormones. And so the dietary strategies that we're discussing are ways to help protect bone and muscle as we age, because we're doing this now as middle-aged athletes, and we want to be athletes in our 70s and 80s also doing that. So it does have to be sort of that big picture thinking.
Yeah, and there's also a really important window in that younger age to load bone on, so that when we get to perimenopause, where we know it's coming down, we have more to kind of more protection ultimately for the inevitable decline that is going to happen from age, I don't know, 40, 50 or whatever, whenever it starts going down, Mikki.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, calcium is the micronutrient that we talk all of the time about with regards to bone health, and it is super important. And the best place to get calcium for people who tolerate dairy is dairy products, but also protein matters. Your bone is 50% protein, and particularly in that young age group, like if they have a healthy appetite, it's probably easy enough for them to get the protein load they need because they're generally eating enough food already. But diet quality is important as well. So we talked about protein quality, but there are other micronutrients that are important for bone health, like silica, boron, magnesium, phosphorus. It's so much more than just calcium. It's all of these things as well. And reducing inflammation. Inflammation is one of a big driver of bone loss. And so if you're not doing things to help with recovery and to reduce inflammation in general, and Paul, I know you wrote a paper about that had this amazing, I still think about it and talk about it often, about the athlete that's unable to recover because their diet's really terrible and they've just got increased inflammation. This is another reason to eat in a way to help reduce inflammation as well, because bone loss is another something that can occur if you're not thinking about things like that.
And how does healthy fats play in there too?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got your omega-3s, which come from fatty fish is the best dietary source of omega-3s. We talk a lot about walnuts and flax seeds and chia seeds being rich sources of omega-3s, but they do have omega-3 fats, which drive the sort of the anti-inflammatory sort of processes in the body. But those omega-3 fats have to be converted into the longer chain fats, the EPA and DHA, that are really what we want. So getting your sardines, salmon, mackerel, for people who don't eat those foods, or for plant-based athletes, and algae supplements, actually, they're a really good source of those omega-3s. But then, of course, you've got people talk about omega-3 fats and omega-6 fats, and omega-6 fats from things like avocado and nuts and seeds and actual food-based sources are not an issue to my mind. It's that a lot of processed foods also have omega-6 fats, which changes that ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 that can either promote or that can promote inflammation can be an issue if you have a diet that's full of processed food, because a lot of processed food has a lot of those omega-6 fats from things like seed oils and things like that, which, again, it comes down to context, but that type of diet generally isn't a diet that is sort of a high-quality diet.
So, Mikki, what would be, in your eyes, the takeaways? We had a really wide-ranging series of conversations today. What would be your takeaways for what we talked about today? What would you say would be the most important information for the older female endurance athlete?
Protein is key, absolutely. And if you have no idea how much protein you're eating, that's an easy enough thing to figure out by writing down what you eat, by jumping on a food app like Chronometer and actually putting it in and actually getting a really good, getting an idea of that. And also, I have to say that if anyone's out there and they're like suffering from many of the things that we're talking about, and they think they need to change their diet, but they're not sure how to change it, first get a gauge on what you're actually doing, because you might think you need to up the protein, but actually you might be lacking in other areas. So get a gauge on what you're actually doing. Auto regulation, what Paul said it really well earlier, like listening to your body, like listening to the things that it's telling you, because it's not, because that's your best gauge on whether what you're doing is working for you. And don't just listen to what you should or shouldn't be doing based on what social media gurus tell you, and instead, figure out what's going on for yourself. Yeah, I think those are, and diet quality. I think that's the last thing I really want to say is, it is really important. For people who tolerate vegetables on it, we haven't even really discussed fiber, and it's not even about fiber. It's about the phytochemicals that good quality produce can provide that you're not going to get if you're not prioritizing your diet, not thinking in advance about what you're doing, because a good diet doesn't happen by accident. You really do have to think about it. So that's really key as well.
Well, that is all for this week, and thank you so much for listening. Join us next week on the Athletes Compass podcast. Ask your training questions in the comments or on our social media. And if you've enjoyed this episode, we'd appreciate it if you take a moment to give us a 5-star review. For more information on how to schedule a consultation with Paul, Mariano, or myself, or with Mikki, check the links in the show notes. Mikki Williden, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your presence. For Mariano Rakai, Dr. Paul Larson, I am Paul Warloski, and this has been the Athletes Compass podcast. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Athletes Compass podcast, your North Star through the sometimes complicated world of training for your endurance sport. We appreciate your comments and training questions and your 5-star reviews. For a deeper dive into the science of endurance sports, listen to the Training Science podcast and check out the adaptive AI training platform Athletica.ai. Thanks for listening.